And so this, if we could take it kind of like spaghetti on the wall, right? If it's good, it'll stick. If it doesn't, just let it fall to the floor. Is there a way for me to control the slides? No, not a problem. So as we start this journey, what we're going to find is that there's a lot of things that you guys already know that I'm going to tell you things you already know. But then we're going to talk about things maybe in a way that you haven't quite heard before, or maybe that you have, but you haven't quite fully put words to it. So there's going to be a lot of pictures. I have 6 kids, and my wife is pregnant with our 7th, and so we like to do things for the youngest to be able to understand in the midst of that. So as we start the Exodus story, what we're going to find, if you could just flip to the first slide and I'll just start. What we're going to find is that the Exodus story, even though its origins, right, are from Genesis, right, is that it starts in the book of Shemot. Shemot means names, and it's odd. It's odd for me, I guess, because I would think that the book of Numbers would be called Shemot, because it starts off with a census and there's tons of names. And yet we start off in the book of Exodus, Shemot. The next slide. And what we find is that Jacob has come to the land of Egypt. He's brought his whole family there. And now a new Pharaoh arises over the land of Egypt, one that didn't know Jacob. And so the people of Israel are there, and they have a harsh ruler, a harsh master. Next slide. And this harsh master sees the growing Israel and sees this as a threat. And so he decides that he's going to kill all the babies who are coming out, all the male babies. And in the midst of this, right, we have baby Moshe who's born, Moses. Next slide. And so Moshe is born and he's hidden. He's ended up put in a reed basket and sent off down the Nile River so that hopefully somebody finds him, not an alligator or a crocodile, so that he can live. And he comes to Pharaoh's daughter who's in there, and Pharaoh's daughter stretches out her hand and rescues baby Moshe from the water. All of these pictures, by the way, if you recognize them, they're all from the Bible Project. They did such a good job, and I was looking for pictures that weren't like piecemeal together, but had some consistency, and this worked out really well. Next slide. So Moshe ends up growing up in the house of Pharaoh, getting raised and trained as an Egyptian, but knowing full well that he is part of the Jewish people. Hold on one second. I love that you have questions. And in the midst of that, he ends up killing one of the taskmasters in an effort to kind of like take his people out from slavery, right? Because in the midst of this, he sees the oppression of his people, and so he goes and he tries to do something about it, and he ends up getting found out, and so he flees to the wilderness and becomes a shepherd. And in the midst of his shepherding, God calls him. He looks upon the burning bush, and God is looking and saying, what is he going to do? Next slide. And so he finds the burning bush. God calls him, tells him to take off his shoes. You know, this is holy ground, and God calls him to his purpose. And this purpose is going to be for the Jewish people, that he's actually going to accomplish what he had set out to do before, but it's going to be a little bit different than how he first envisioned it to be. Sorry, I forgot to press my timer. Next slide. So with all that gumption, Moshe goes before Pharaoh, and he says, hey, I need you to let my people go. We need to worship God, and we need to worship God alone, and that requires us to leave here. And Pharaoh doesn't like that idea. Pharaoh is not just opposed to it, but because of his request, he makes the lives of the Israelites harder. Next slide. And they're asked to do the same amount of work with less amount of material, and the hardship ensues, and everyone's like, what's going on? Next slide. And so Moshe begins this dialogue with Pharaoh. And in the midst of this dialogue with Pharaoh, the plagues come, right? And over again, we have Pharaoh hardens his heart, and Pharaoh hardens his heart, and Pharaoh hardens his heart. And then there's a switch, and then God starts hardening his heart. God starts hardening his heart. And I think what could be said in the midst of that is that the word that we use for harden is also the word for strengthen, chazak. And in the midst of this, we could look at it as like him like kind of embittering himself against it. Or we could look at it in him saying, I'm going to choose my own will despite what I'm being asked to do. And that there's a point in life where your circumstances can be so great and so overwhelming and so overbearing, and things can be going so bad that you just kind of give up and give in and just say, whatever's going on, like whatever you want, right? You're just so overwhelmed. And so I look at this and I say, when God started hardening Pharaoh's heart, he's not turning him away. What he's doing is he's strengthening Pharaoh's heart to continue making the choice for himself, as opposed to being in a place where he would normally choose to say, okay, you guys can go, this is like too much. God is giving him the strength to continue making his own choices, and he continues to reject God. And there comes all the plagues, and then we land on the last plague. Slide. And the last plague is the plague of the death of all the firstborn. And this was going to sweep through all of the people, and it was going to touch every person. If you remember within the book of, or within the Exodus story, that most of the Israelite people are located in the land of Goshen. And so if you think about the Nile River Delta, Goshen is actually to the east of that. It's a land, it's good for pasturing, and that's what the Israelites were. They were shepherds. They were kind of tending to the flock. They're really rich and vibrant land that are really great for cattle and livestock. And so this death of the firstborn, the angel of the Lord is going to come through, and he's going to kill all of the firstborn, and everyone's going to be touched. Slide. Oh, and it even affects Pharaoh. Pharaoh's firstborn. Oh, thank you so much. I love this. Control. All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. So even Pharaoh's affected. His firstborn dies. But in the midst of that, we find God making provision for the nation of Israel. He says, you're going to take in a lamb, and what I want you to do is I want you to slaughter the lamb, I want you to take the blood, and I want you to take a branch of hyssop, and you're going to smear it on the blood door, and when the angel of death comes upon the door, he's going to see it, and he's going to pass over that house, right? He's going to overlook that house, saying, no, this house is protected by the blood of the lamb. And so all the Israelite students, everybody in their household, but what we see is that there's a provision and protection for God's people, but if God's people didn't listen to what God had told them, the angel of death would have visited their house. So in the midst of all of this, right, Pharaoh is finally, it's the last straw, and he goes out and he says, you need to leave. You can't be here anymore. And it says that Israel plundered Egypt as they left. We wonder where they got all of this gold for the tabernacle. They took it from Egypt as they're walking out. In the midst of that, Pharaoh decides that he doesn't actually want to let them go. There's a lot of people and a lot of labor, and so he decides to pursue them. And so they're waiting on the banks, waiting to cross the Red Sea. And this is the first time we see the word salvation, not in a biblical sense, because there's other passages in Genesis that talk about salvation in a personal sense. But where we talk about we're going to wait and be still and wait for the Lord, and he will save us. Save us in a physical sense. He's going to deliver us from our pursuing enemies. And so Moshe crosses the Red Sea. Pharaoh ends up pursuing, and their armies are destroyed. Done, kaput. They no longer have a pursuer. So God has brought them out of the land of Egypt and has saved them from their pursuing aggressors. And so now what? Right now, they're going to go, right? God is going to lead them into following him. And so they're looking forward, and we come to Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, God goes and he's going to give the nation of Israel his commands, the 10 things, the 10 commandments. And in the midst of the 10 commandments, God descends upon the mountain, and people are rejoicing and people are scared, right? They're terrified. And there's this point where it's like, let nobody come on the mountain, let no animals come on the mountain, you're going to surround the mountain, nothing's going to come up it. But then there's one point where they're kind of invited up, and the people are like, whoa, no, we're going to die if we do this. Moshe, you go for us, and you go and you ascend the mountain, and in the midst of ascending the mountain, you can kind of be our intermediary. And so up on the mountain, Moshe is given the 10 Commandments, and he's talked about the instructions. But all of this, right, all of this is that Israel is brought out of captivity to Egypt, and now they're going to go and serve God like they promised and talked to Moses before. What they talked to Pharaoh, Moses talked to Pharaoh before. And it's also that they can be God's people. And so to be God's people requires that you understand how your king, your leader, the person who you're worshiping, desires for you to worship him. And so God has given them instructions, and in the midst of that, he gets really angry, right? This is the point where Moshe is up on the mountain, and he doesn't quite know what's going on. God's like, I'm just going to kill all of them. I'm going to wipe them out. I'm going to start over with you. And Moshe intercedes. He says, heaven forbid that you would do that you would bring them out of Egypt, and you would be known as a God who saved his people only to kill them in the wilderness. And so God says, okay, well, you guys are going to go, and I'm gonna give you plans, and you're gonna go. And Moshe stops. He says, hey, listen, we're not gonna leave this mountain unless you go with us. And so God talks to Moshe, and he says, okay, Moshe, I'm going to give you plans for a tabernacle. I'm going to give you plans so that I can dwell in the midst of you, so that I can travel with you, because right now as you sit, I can't travel with you. You guys are not acting the way that you can be, and I'm a holy God. I'm set apart from everything that you're doing and from the place that you're going, so I need a space that I can reside in the midst of you that's good enough so that you guys won't be consumed and destroyed. So Moshe ends up coming down the mountain, and he sees what everybody is doing, the idol of the calf, and in the midst of this, we wonder, right? We're like, God just spoke to you. How can you be so flippant? How can you just walk away so quick? This is what I ask myself. I'm like, how? And then I look at my life. I'm like, okay, it's not too far off. But in the midst of this, right, Moshe is sad and enraged. He's like, how can you guys do this? And Moshe had been gone for a while at that point, right? We know that when he went up on the mountain, he was gone for 40 days, and he was fasting, both food and water. And so this was a time of uncertainty, right? They're brought out of this land, right? They were just provided for and everything, and now their leader is gone, and they're like, okay, we'll make this like surrogate leader in the form of a golden calf. And in the midst of this, we find some really awkward things, and like Aaron makes the golden calf, and yet he's not punished. But all the people who worship the golden calf, they're all killed. And so we find ourselves, right, after this, all the Levites come in, they slaughter 3,000 people, and the tabernacle, the wilderness tabernacle is built. God's presence descends upon the tabernacle, but we find that Moshe is not able to enter into the tabernacle to be with God. And that brings us to Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. We call it Numbers. We skipped over Leviticus. Leviticus is such a unique book because it pauses the narrative. It's almost like time stops when we hit Leviticus. And there's a lot that I could say, but not in 30 minutes. And so we enter the wilderness. We're pushing off from Mount Sinai. Bamidbar starts off with the numbering of the people, right, as they're going to go in and go up to the land, and so the people are numbered. They're then ordered in how the layout of the camp is going to be, and they're talked about the marching formation with the Ark of the Covenant leading the people as they walk through the wilderness. Now, this is not a long journey, right? The journey from Mount Sinai all the way up to the Promised Land is a relatively short journey, but sometimes we tend to take the short, long way instead of the long, short way. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we try to expedite what we're doing, and it ends up bringing us and taking longer than it would if we would have taken more time in the preparation than we would. And so they're walking, they're heading to the wilderness of Paran, and people start complaining from the onset, right? Like, we are good complainers. And they're complaining about food, and They're complaining about water. And in the midst of that, Miriam and Aharon, Moses' siblings, start complaining about Moshe. And we know that Miriam's put outside the camp for 7 days, and they continue on and they hit the wilderness of Paran. And they have even more hardship, right? They go and they send 12 spies to scout out the land, and we know that 2 come back and they report that this land is bountiful. It's everything that God told us that it would be. And yet we have 10 people who are saying, no, this isn't what we want. These people, we're like crickets to these people. There's no way we can win. And the 10 outweigh the 2. And the rest of Israel is stirred up so much that they bring rebellion. And they're like, we're just going to overthrow Moshe and kind of do our own thing, and maybe we'll go back to the land of Egypt. And in the midst of that, God says that every single person who's 20 years of age and up is going to perish in the wilderness, that not a single person will be left, except for Joshua and Caleb, the 2 people who came back and said that this is a good land, we should do it. And so God pronounces that, and so instead of making a straight journey, now they start wandering, right? They wander in the wilderness of Moab for 40 years, and it's 40 years of death and hardship, and in the midst of that, even Moshe slips up and removes the sanctity of God by striking the rock twice when God commanded him to speak to the rock for water to come out. And he's forbidden to enter the land. We find that the people rebel, and the people are afflicted with the curse of the serpents. And at the same time, God provides a way through the bronze serpent that's raised up to be a salvation for them. So we're not on a good path, but we're accomplishing the means the whole time. The old generation is passing away, and the young generation is being raised up. And so in the midst of their complaining and grumbling and hardship, what we find is that as they approach Moab, that we have the story of Balaam and Balak, right? And so Balak is the king of Moab, and he goes to Balaam, the priest, and he says, hey, you know, these people are going to be a problem. I want you to curse Israel. And so he goes, and there's this wonderful exchange with him and God as he's talking to God and then talking to donkey. I felt like I was reading like a Shrek in Bible form. And every time he goes to curse Israel, blessing comes down. And that the last blessing talks about this king that's going to come. And this king is going to be a star and a scepter for Israel, and he's going to defeat Israel's enemies. And what we find in the midst of that is while Israel's complaining, without them even knowing about it, God is still blessing them. And so that concludes with Baal Peor, right, where we have the first human kebab, and Pinchas goes and skewers 2 people and ends the hardship against Israel with his zeal. Israel's then numbered again, and all of the old generation has passed away. We come across 2 opponents. Right as we come up to the Jordan, there are 2 countries, or 2 kingdoms, we should probably say, that are there in the kingdom of Sihon and Og. And these 2 are going to be kind of the buffer for the promised land. That these 2 kingdoms must be defeated before Israel's going to cross over the Jordan and enter into the promised land. And then we get to Devarim. Devarim just means words or things. We know it as Deuteronomy. And it starts off, it also really accounts, and why it's things or words, right, is we're talking about Moshe actually retelling the instructions of God to the people, right, as we've defeated, right, if we think about our timeline, we defeated Sihon and Og at the end of Bamidbar, at the end of Numbers, and we're waiting, and Moshe's talking to the people, and he talks to them about the Shema. He tells them that they're going to need to love the Lord the God with all their heart, mind, soul, and strength. And he reiterates a whole bunch of other things, but the idea of listen and obey and listen and love are cyclical ideas, right? When we talk about listening, we're not talking about just hearing, we're talking about responding to the hearing. And that it is out of a true and genuine love for God that our obedience should come from. And there's this portion of the Shema that I feel like we say, but we often overlook. And it says, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength. And these commandments which I command you today shall be upon your heart. Right? They shall be upon your heart. They shall be something that consumes your mind. There's something it's on your heart, as in like you just love to do these things. You don't just do them because you're told to, but that there's a genuine thrust of who you are in the midst of them. And so Moshe, as he finishes, he sets off and he says, today I set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. And this is different from the Genesis narrative, right? The Genesis narrative, that they had the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, good and evil, and they were told not to eat from the tree of knowledge. And here, Moshe switches the script. He says, you have two things before you. So instead of saying, don't choose death, he says, choose life. And Moshe knows that this is the life that they need to serve God, that this life is going to benefit and prosper them, right? That's what Devarim is all about. That's what Deuteronomy is all about, is all of the blessings that Israel's going to get when they follow God and they obey his commandments. And on the flip side of that what God is going to allow to happen or even do to his people when they're disobedient. But Moshe knows, he's been with them for 40 years. He knows that they're going to be disobedient. He says that, I know that when I'm gone, you're going to walk away, and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen to you. And he foretells about what happens to Israel. And he foretells about the hardship that they're going to experience. And in the midst of this, the problem is the heart. The problem is that we don't have a heart that's good enough. As much as we try, right? Generation after generation will fall away, and then there will be one generation that will bring us back, only to start the cycle all over again. After that, we find that Moshe hands off charge of Israel, not to his son, but to Joshua. And Joshua is going to be the people who leads Israel into the land he wants to be, but he pleads with God, hey, please let me go. And God says, no, and you're not going to ask anymore, but I'll let you see it. And so Moshe takes the written Torah, and he puts it inside the Ark of the Covenant, and he ascends the mountain to look upon the promised land and then to pass away. And that's where we end the book of Deuteronomy. We end the book not in the promised land, with the leader dead and a people who are ready to enter. So we're going to look at this again in a brand new light. Some slides are different, some slides are the same. But what I find is that in the midst of this is that everybody, especially God's people, right, when we all start off, we're all in slavery. We're all in slavery to a harsh master. And this harsh master wants to own and control us. He doesn't want to let us go. He wants to make our life hard, and he is tough, right? Sin is tough. And sin ruins your life while at the same time making you think that it's a good thing, right? Because how could the nation of Israel say we want to go back if there wasn't something about Egypt that was worth going back to in the midst of hardship? And this is what sin does to the lives of everybody, right? It convinces us that what we're doing is okay. It convinces us that in the midst of what's happening, that it's an okay place to stay, that we're provided for, that we have our needs. Maybe it's hard work and maybe we have hard times, but it's not what we're looking for. And we, in the midst of that, right, flipping the script a little bit, we're a lot like Pharaoh, especially at this point in time, right? God is saying, come to me, and we say no. God says, I want you to do this, and we say no, especially before we were followers of Yeshua. Right? Like, this is our life, and God allows our actions to culminate in real world effects that bring hardship into our lives. And he doesn't prevent it. In the midst of that, we know that all of this culminates, all of these 10 commands, all these 10 plagues culminate in death. That is going to kill each and every one of us, and there's nothing that we can do about it, except God says, I know you and I've chosen you, right? And I have a way for you. And it's through the blood that's put on the door that we often talk about as like a one-time thing, right? Like the death of Yeshua, Jesus, is a one-time death, and that blood permeates even as we celebrate Pesach or Passover, that we don't put the blood on the doorpost again. We celebrate it, we remember it, but we never do that again. And so this is going to be the set free point, right? This is how we enter into a life that's separate from death, and we get free from this master. It's through the blood of the Lamb that's put on the doorpost, right? In him we have redemption through the blood. We were singing about that this morning. I thought it was very timely. And so we have this person, Moshe, but I want you to remember in Deuteronomy that Moshe says that there's going to be another leader that's going to come that's like me. And the whole book of Matthew is culminating to say Yeshua is that other Moshe person, that Yeshua is Moshe. And so we're going to replace, in this shape, we're going to replace Moshe with Yeshua. And so Yeshua is going to lead us through the waters of the Red Sea. And I want you to think about that as immersion, right? The blood of the Lamb was given, you crossed the Red Sea, and you have been immersed into the new kingdom of God. And in the midst of your immersion, there's a cutting off. There's a finishing. There's a finality in the midst of everything that happens. You're no longer you no longer are a slave to sin anymore. You no longer have this other master. And now that we no longer have this other master, right, and we are now renewed, as it were, we were born again, as it were, we now need to know, what does it look like for us in the reality of Yeshua as we live our lives? And that's where Mount Sinai comes in, right? Mount Sinai is where our instructions are given. Because if we're a people that are set apart for something, that there's a way that our people are given. And so it's interesting that the people, right, aren't given a law before, but only after, right? Because it's not by our works that we're saved, right? We were saved, and then we were given instructions on how we're supposed to live. And this is also the culmination, as we look at, of the Shavuot, right? And the blowing as God descends upon the mountain, and we hear great trumpets sounding from the top of the mountain, that we can then compare that as we look in the book of Acts. And we say, okay, in the midst of all of the people waiting and Pentecost to come, that there was a great and mighty wind and tongues of fire. And if you take a shofar, if you were to blow a shofar and you were to remove the shofar, all you're going to do is produce wind, because now we are the shofars of God. That we are going to be the people that resound the sound of God's triumphant journey with his people. And for this, some people rejoice in this, but some people don't. You know, even those who are saved, right? Those people who have been rescued from sin, that this is not necessarily a good thing for them. And all of this is culminating so that we can be a people of priests, so that we can be people who are taking God into the world as we journey, and that through us, right, we can be representatives, intermediaries, that we can draw people to God through our lives. And we have this tabernacle, right? The building of the tabernacle is God desires to be in, amongst, and with us. That this tabernacle is no longer going to be a physical tabernacle, even though that doesn't do away with the physical tabernacle, but that we each are going to be living stones that are all part of this tabernacle, and that when we come together, that this is the tabernacle that God talks about, and God's Spirit dwells within us. But we still have idols in our lives. We still have, like, as much as we would like to say, you know, I put my faith in Yeshua and now I don't sin anymore, that, like, there's still rebellion that lurks in our heart. And that makes God sad and angry, right? We look at the book of Hebrews, and the book of Hebrews has some really harsh words to say about people who are still practicing sin, who, have tasted of the goodness of God, but are not necessarily part of the fold, right? These people who are like, Lord, Lord, I knew you, right? And he's going to say, I'm sorry, I didn't know who you were. And so now we have a way to encamp around, right? Because we're all different. We all are different parts of the body, whether that be through mouth or whether through hands. There's this order to how God is in the midst of us, and yet our camps look a little bit different, right? This is a little bit more defined, but we tend to be a congregation, right? If you look at Israel as a whole, that it has all these pieces, and just like us, right, as we are the coming together, right, is the tabernacle of God, that we are these outer pieces that all have different parts. And in the midst of that, in the midst of our marching orders, that it's going to be God who leads us. It's going to be God who points us where to go now that we're part of his people. And so we are on a journey, right? We're on a journey to the promised land. But we complain. We grumble. We rebel against God in little areas. Maybe it's not overtly. Maybe we don't actually have idols. Like I don't have an idol, but sometimes things creep into my life that if you were to look at it and say, I think you're worshiping that more than you're worshiping God. And because of that, we also must die in the wilderness. That just as Israel was not able to enter the promised land, we also are not able to enter the promised land, but not in its essence. Our old self is not able to enter the promised land. It's our new self that is. So the old self must die in the wilderness so that we can then be new and enter into the promised land. That this is the pattern of our life. Oftentimes I thought about that and I'm like, okay, well, how does this all work out? But I don't think that we exit the wilderness until we die. That this life here and now, even though we have a taste of the kingdom, that's coming but not yet, right? The promised land that's like there, but not totally. We're still part of God's nation. Is that we, in the midst of this, are still walking in the wilderness today. That we have things in our lives that need to die and need to pass away. And that there are parts of our lives that are fit for the kingdom, and that there are parts that are not. And so what God says is, he says, in this very wilderness shall your carcasses drop. Your children who you said would be carried, sorry, I can't see very well. Thank you, carried off. These I will allow to enter, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But your carcasses shall drop in the wilderness. And that's what's going to happen to us, right? Paul writes about that extensively, about how we need to die. The flesh needs to go away. And so too, that's what our wilderness journey is about. So when we encounter hardships, when we encounter trials, and when we encounter these things that change and transition us, that this is part of the journey, that this is a necessary step in the journey for us to be able to move into the new self that is growing up within us. And I think that this is often interesting. We don't often associate the bronze serpent with John 3:16, yet it is the very thing that precedes John 3:16. That it just as Moshe lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, just as our rebellion causes hardship in the midst of us, that God doesn't allow us in the midst of the wilderness to be overcome by our hardship if we just look up to what he's provided for, right? If we look towards Yeshua, right? It's not that our circumstances change, because sucky circumstances suck, but it's our perspective, right? When we look at hardship and our circumstances with joy and anticipation that this is bringing about the new self, and that God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose, that this is what's happening in the midst of us. But we still complain, and we still grumble, and we still have idiosyncrasies where we believe one thing and do another. But in the midst of that, God is still looking out for us. Just as he was looking out for Israel in the midst of the world trying to curse us without us knowing, God is turning all of these bad things for our good. God is looking out for us in the midst of the wilderness, even when we can't see it, even when we're still grumbling, that God is there and present. And so we, right, when we finally get to that place, we will be counted again and we will be new. We will be made new, right, a new creation. And we'll be able to enter into the promised land. But what we have before we do that is we have this conflict with Sihon and Og. Now Sihon was one of the lands that Israel reached out to and says, hey, we want to pass through your land. We're just going to the promised land over there. We won't eat anything that we come across. We won't drink any of your water. We literally just want a path. And Sihon says, absolutely not, takes up arms against Israel. Og is like massive, right? He's known as the king of Bashan, and he's described by his bed, right? He has this iron bed that's measured out in cubits. This was a very large dude. But what I see in the midst of that is I see the undertone of human reason and comfort, right? If bed is a place of rest and comfort, and this idea of like, hey, just let me walk through, and we won't do anything to offset you or harm you in any way, that it's only through human reason or logic and comfort that, that are going to oppose us in our walk to the promised land. And I think that we can see that as we look in our lives, that comfort or complacency tends to bring us to a place with God where we're not fully reliant on him as we should be. That it is an adversary against us. And so too is our way of thinking and trying to do things and using our own strength to accomplish our means, that these are things that are going to be barriers to us as we desire to enter into God's promise. And they must be conquered before we can enter in. You know, I find it interesting as we think about 1 John, and he's writing, right, I write to you old men that you may know God. I write to you young men, right, and he writes to the children. And that what he says to the young men is he says that you know the power of God and that you've overcome the adversary. That there's an overcoming of the adversary in a young man's life before he can walk and reach maturity. And so Yeshua, in the midst of all of this, right, gives us instructions. He leaves us with instructions before he goes, because he can't stay with us. He must go. And it all revolves around the Shema, this listen and love. And we are going to be decided on how we enter into that as God's people, right? It's not that that's what makes us God's people, but this listen and love mentality is like, are you obedient and do you love God? Because if we don't have one of those things, right, we're walking in error. And so again, we're put before life and death, blessing and curse. And we want to choose life, right? We need to choose life. The problem, right, is that we also have a really hard time because of our flesh. It gets in the way oftentimes. But we have this promise in Ezekiel, right? This promise that God is going to put his spirit within us, that he's going to remove our heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh. And that this heart of flesh is going to culminate with us being able to be obedient, to walk in the ways where we were unable to before, and we are able to walk in the fullness while we're still in the midst of the wilderness. And so there's a handing over. Just as Yeshua had to go away, Yehoshua is going to be the one that's going to lead us into the promised land. And we're waiting for his return to this day. And we're looking forward to that return. And in the midst of that, right, God's word is stored in the midst of us, in the midst of every single one of us. And it is through our collective and communal efforts together that we can uphold this. It's through a community of believers, not through an individual solo person. And so now we're waiting, looking out to the promised land, waiting for that time to come. I think I'm over my time. Excuse me, I apologize. And so I ask you, where are you in the midst of your wilderness journey? What more of your old self needs to die away so that you can continue to walk in the fullness of what God has promised? Because God talks about in the Psalms, he says, the wilderness generation I despised. And what that means for us is that we can be loved and despised at the same time because of the life that we're living of complaining and still being in the midst of our old self. And so the old self must be put away so that we can walk in the fullness, right? Because we can walk as fully pleasing to God here and now. And so now I'm going to invite you guys to break up in groups of 3, 2 or 3, and pray together about whatever the Lord leads you to do. And then we'll come back together and finish up with another time of worship, I believe. Thank you.